Park, everybody. Thank you for coming here today. And I'm going to talk to you for about 45 minutes about the general history of this place and hopefully some of the modern resonances as well, which you'll recognise from your work as far as human factors in cybersecurity go. But first off, what does Bletchley Park do? What is this place and why are we interested in it? Bletchley Park is the home of British code breaking during World War II. It's home to an organisation called the Government Code and Cipher School, and then Britain's cryptanalytic agency. They break enemy code and ciphers, and they do what becomes known, thanks to their work at Bletchley Park, as signals intelligence, which is defined in this way by the American National Security Agency. Signals intelligence derived from electronic signals and systems used by foreign targets such as communication systems, radars, and weapons systems. But mostly with World War II, we're talking about communication systems, radio communications. It provides a vital window into foreign adversaries' capabilities, actions, and intentions. And so people here are analysing enemy communications during the war, deriving intelligence from them, which helps the Allies. Hard to quantify exactly how, to what extent, but helps the Allies to win the war more quickly and easily than they would have done otherwise. The Government Code and Cipher School comes out of First World War code breaking, so there are organisations doing this sort of work going really back to the Middle Ages, but in a modern sense, certainly back to the First World War. There's radio communications being intercepted and also telegraphic communications being worked on in places such as Room 40 at the Admiralty in London. And at the end of World War I, these successful code-breaking organisations are amalgamated into the Government Code and Cipher School to go forward into the future. They're based here. This is 54 Broadway, just opposite St James's Park Tube Station and that iconic building, 55 Broadway, which you might have seen on Horizon 4 on TV recently, right in the heart of Westminster. But in the 1930s, with war looming, with the threat of Germany on the horizon, and people can see that this is going to be problematic for an organisation based in London, which is likely to be bombed. And so the head of MI6, who oversees the code breaking, a man called Admiral Sir Hugh Sinclair, purchases Bletchley Park just before the war. And the code breaking organisation comes here first in late 1938 for a period by is the main road to north of the country at that point, and it's where the main telecommunication lines run as well. So plugging Bletchley Park into the national, what's known as the Defence Teleprinter Network, the national communication system used by the military, is very straightforward. And so they can bring in all the intercepting messages that they need. They're not intercepting messages here, they're intercepting them in a series of radio stations around the country and around the world, known as Y stations. Those can be brought in, and the intelligence which is being produced here can be sent out very easily because of those communication systems. And also there's the fact that Bletchley Park is vacant and available for purchase. It's not an ideal place to buy. At the start of the war, you have the mansion and a few estate buildings. Thankfully, the organisation isn't too big. You're talking about 150, 180 people around when war breaks out. And they're working here in the mansion. This room was used as their communications room, their teleprinter room at the start of the war. And the rooms towards the front of the mansion we use for the actual code-breaking work. But very quickly, they're bringing in new recruits. The organisation is expanding. People like Alan Turing are being recruited from the universities for all the work that the organisation needs to do. And they're very quickly outgrowing the space. And so they start to move into wooden huts in the ground, which are put up in very short notice, which are very uncomfortable, drafty in the winter and too hot in the summer, and not ideal working accommodation later on. We see a few of the huts in the ground, so it's a very small operation at this point, in I think late 1939, when this particular photo was taken. So we've got a model of code breaking here at this point, which is very manual, where individuals are taking a message and they're completing all of the processes in the chain from the initial analysis of what is this message and how do I break it, through to doing code breaking, through to translating it and coming up with a finished product. And Bletchley Park and the GCCS is really considered as a code-breaking agency in a quite literal sense. It breaks messages and it gives them to other people to interpret what they mean and to derive the importance from them. If we of course, we've got recreation as well. We have a very rarefied atmosphere here early in the war. A lot of the books refer to dons and debs. You have dons from the universities doing most of the work, mostly male. They're supported by these debs, young upper-class ladies who are recruited largely on the basis of their social background, and in combination with that, the fact that they're good at what they do. They do a lot of backroom work and with a great deal of enthusiasm, if not a great deal of professional skill, because they don't have that educational background. We fast forward to the end of the war. Bletchley Park is a completely different place, and we begin to refer to it as an intelligence factory. It really is a factory. It's enormous. You can see how many buildings are built. We have something like 15 different huts are eventually built, and then 8 of these large permanent brick office buildings, which completely change the character of the estate. The work is split into a much more modern way of working, factory style working, where code-breaking operations are split into smaller jobs that individually less skilled people can do, and they form a production line that takes intelligence from an intercepted message to outgoing synthetic intelligence product, and that means the individuals often only know their part of that chain. They become specialists in doing a particular job, whether that's subtracting one set of numbers from another, or working out a particular component of a particular cipher system, and then passing the information on the chain, and later on there will be people who translate that message, who keep indexes of the information it contains for later reference, and who handle the communication of that intelligence on to whoever might need it. At its peak, Bletchley Park has almost 9,000 employees, overwhelmingly women by the end of the war, 75% women. That's because they've been drafted in large numbers. We're looking at large numbers of service women working here. They are an available source of labour, relatively cheap, and can be trained up to do the various jobs that are needed here. The large number of service women working in areas like communications, machine operations as well. These staff are not living at the park itself. They're accommodated in the area. Bletchley is not an enormous place. Well, I'm quite often asked how did they keep it all secret, and the fact is Bletchley Park wasn't secret in the sense that local people certainly knew it was here, because you can't drop 9,000 people on a place like Bletchley, and almost double the population, without anyone noticing. The thing is that people don't know what they're working on. But the park itself, on the right hand side of this photo, but also on the left hand side, large military camps for accommodating all of those staff working here. And part of a much wider system as well at this point, we have Bletchley Park is not the only place where this work is going on. They start to establish outposts in various other places, which we tend to call outstations. We have outstations for the use of cryptanalytic machines, these bomb machines used to break the Enigma cipher, and 2 big outstations on the outskirts of London, at Eastcote and Stanmore, which themselves are enormous installations. Each of them, I mean, in the film The Imitation Game, it's shown that Alan Turing built a single bomb machine, and that's it. In reality, the British have 200 of these machines. 100 each of these outstations, a number at Bletchley Park, and a number of smaller outstations in the Buckinghamshire countryside. And also 100 of these machines developed by the Americans and used in Washington as well. And a system where analysts at Bletchley Park can come up with programs for these machines, essentially, send them over to the Atlantic, the Americans run the tests, and then send the results back again. So Bletchley Park is part of an enormous linked up communications and intelligence system well later in the war. This includes the interception services as well. You've got 9,000 people at Bletchley Park, you've got about 17,000 out there around the world intercepting enemy communications. This is the Y station, a naval Y station at Flowerdown near Winchester, and there are about 300 of these stations in the UK and about 200 around the world. It really is an enormous operation. And they also have to think about how you disseminate the intelligence which is being produced here. And so a new system is required. These units called special liaison units are attached to allied commands out fighting the war, and they take the intelligence from Bletchley Park and share it with them, ensuring that it's acted on in a sensible way, that the customer understands what they're receiving. They also understand the need to keep it secure and make sure none of this stuff goes missing. This is what that intelligence sort of looks like when it's leaving Bletchley Park. We tend to know it as Ultra. When Bletchley Park starts reading the most secure enemy ciphers like Enigma, they need a security classification which is higher than top secret, or most secret as they normally refer to it at that time, and so they come up with Ultra. And then this term is applied to all of this intelligence as well. And that's what really makes Bletchley Park special, and that's the big shift that it goes through between the beginning of the war and the end of the war, is that it becomes not just a code-breaking agency, but an intelligence agency in its own right. It's producing the finished intelligence, it's doing all of the analysis, it is the authority on the material it is producing, and it's where the experts are who can tell you, not just break messages, but tell you what they mean and tell you what the enemy are up to. And there are people here, I think it's fair to say, who understand the German Army and the German Air Force and their Navy better than they understand themselves. Because those in the German system is very fractured. Fascist state tends to work by putting people into different groups and making them compete, so nobody knows what everyone else is up to. At Bletchley Park, they have all that information in one place, all accessible to the same group of people. And so they know pretty much everything that's worth knowing. And it leads to a real shift in the emphasis of the work they're doing and leading to a modern conception of what we understand as signals intelligence, which is still applied by agencies like GCHQ in Cheltenham, which is Bletchley Park's successor today, and also the American National Security Agency. So what is Bletchley Park actually breaking as far as code breaking is concerned? Here is an Enigma machine. This is I'm sure many of you will be familiar with it, showing it's on the background of your PowerPoint. This is Bletchley Park's #1 source of information about the Germans, especially. It's not the only machine cipher which Bletchley Park attacks and succeeds in breaking, and it's not even the most secure, but it is probably the most important because the Germans use it so widely. For their Army, Navy and Air Force, they produce, we think, about 50,000 Enigma machines. And in a way, the Germans cause themselves problems by getting them into machine ciphers at a very early stage. They adopt these machines. Initially, they're a commercial design, but the Germans take that commercial design, they modify it, and they're using it from the late 1920s. By the early 1940s, it's not the best machine on the market, but the Germans are so wedded to Enigma at that point that they have to keep using it. The way the cipher is produced is that you have what it is a very effective, a very complicated series of light switches. Mechanically, it's fairly simple. You press a key on the keyboard, and a different letter lights up on the lamp board that you can see behind. It doesn't print, it doesn't give you a nice neat copy of your message, it just makes light up in a particular way. And despite that, the encipherment is vastly complicated. When you press a key, the current passes through a plug board on the front of the machine, which you can just make out there, and then it passes through these 3 rotors at the back of the machine. And these are wired inside in a apparently random way, which is difficult for an attacker to guess. And then the current, having passed through the rotors, makes its way to the lamp board and lights on one of those lamps. What makes the machine secure is that every time you type a letter, the rotors move. So if you imagine the alphabet you're using to substitute one letter for another, every time you press a letter, that alphabet changes. And the number of letters you can type before the rotors get back to the original position is 16,900. So it's far longer than any message you're going to need to type, which means every letter of your message is using effectively a different cipher. And therefore you have a cipher which isn't vulnerable to things like frequency analysis or any sort of linguistic analysis, which have traditionally been used to break codes in the past. If you look at the permutations of the rotors in their positions, you can take the rotors out of the machine and put them in different orders, so that increases the complexity, and then you account for the plug order in front of the machine, which swaps letters in pairs as well. You get this number, which is 103 sextillion, I think, or 103,000 million. I got curious the other day and did the maths, and I quite often used to say that this number was more than the second since the elapsed since the Big Bang. But actually, I did the calculations, and this is 26,000 times the number of seconds since the beginning of the universe. It's quite a big number, and you cannot break this cipher. I don't need to tell you guys, you know this already, but you cannot break this cipher through brute force. So how do you go about breaking it? Well, the fact is Enigma would have been unbreakable if it had been used properly. And Bletchley Park only makes any progress against it because of human error. And these fall into three areas. You have procedural errors, and people are instructed to use the machine in an insecure way. And then you have the ignorance of the operators in good cybersecurity. They make mistakes which they shouldn't do, which they would have avoided doing had they been better briefed on what makes the cipher vulnerable. And then you just have operator laziness. They can't be bothered, so they cut corners. And so I'm going to run through a few examples of this. But it's interesting to note before we do that we quite often get the depiction that Bletchley Park breaks Enigma and then the job is done. You can read it from that point onwards. The main problem is the Germans change the ciphers every single day, so you have to keep attacking them on a daily basis. But secondly, those vulnerabilities which we're exploiting also change over time. Particular networks will be vulnerable to attack in particular ways. You need to understand the enemy radio networks. You need to keep monitoring what the vulnerabilities are that you can exploit. And you need to stay on top of that if you're going to break the ciphers in the future. And sometimes you have to break ciphers which aren't giving you any good intelligence. Because when they do start producing intelligence, at that point you'll be able to read them. Or you need to break weak ciphers, which are of no intelligence value again, because they give you a way into stronger ciphers. And so there's an enormous juggling act going on between people intercepting messages, people breaking messages, and people producing intelligence at Bletchley Park, which is all designed to streamline the system as much as possible. So at the end of the day, they are breaking the messages that they need to break. And at enormous scale as well, a scale of about 2,000 messages from Enigma every single day. That's not to mention all the other cyber systems which they're working on here as well. It's all being worked on in this section, Hut 6. You can see some ladies in Hut 6 working on cryptanalysis using some captured Enigma machines. So the first errors which the Germans commit are procedural errors. The operators are instructed to use the machine in an insecure manner. And the initial breaking of Enigma, you may know it was informed by breaking of Enigma by Polish code breakers, who give the British a leg up just before the war. That initial breaking all depends on procedural errors. As an example, the German key setters, when they come with key sheets which are distributed to operators to tell them how to set up the machine, they adhere to rules like no rotor order shall be repeated in the same month. So if you've seen a rotor order in the Enigma, on that side of the key, in the same month, you won't see it again. So you can rule it out of your calculations going forward from that point on. But they also do things like not using the same rotor in the same position of the machine on successive days. So So if you've seen that rotor order on the previous day, you know it won't come up. This means by the end of a particular month, before the key sheets are updated, the cryptanalysts in Hut 6 can rule out about half the possibilities in some cases, just based on how they know the Germans design their cipher keys. And by, there are people in Germany clearly who understand cybersecurity and are able to make progress in increasing the security of the ciphers. But often the people making the decisions don't have good grasp of cybersecurity. And they think with rules like that, by applying rules like that to their key setting, they're adding randomness to the system, but actually they're reducing the randomness of the system. The Germans also suffer from making these improvements in a piecemeal way over time. So in the beginning, the Germans were only using 2 or 3 cipher keys for their entire military. Later on, by the end of the war, Bletchley Park is counting about 200. At any point, the Germans are using about 60. Bletchley Park are only breaking about 20 of those. But because the Germans start off with sort of relatively simple systems and only increase the complexity of the procedure later on, Bletchley Park are able to overcome each procedural improvement as it's made and keep the ball rolling on Enigma breaking right to the end of the war. We also have poor training among the operators. They tend to do things like reuse cipher keys, so if Bletchley have broken certain messages the day before or maybe even a few months before, they can read new messages for free if they recognise the same cipher keys are being used. That's obviously very straightforward. But what the Germans do, they're very good at giving the enemy predictable messages to work with. They're messages which are predictable in when they're sent, how long they are, and what the underlying plaintext of the message is. Therefore, you can do what's called a known plaintext attack on the cipher. They tend to know this during the war as cribbing. The crib is a sort of cheat sheet used at public schools to pass tests. And so if you know what's in a message, you have a crib that can help you break it. This is the principle embodied in the bomb machines developed by Alan Turing, of which I said there were about 200 of them. If you can make a guess at what's in the cipher, if you can make a guess at the plaintext underlying the cipher message which you've intercepted, you can design a machine which just grinds through every possibility of the Enigma rotors until they find a solution where your ciphertext matches your guessed plaintext. Gordon Welshman, the man who's in charge of Hut 6, he is on record during the war as saying that there was a German radio operator in North Africa who every morning sends exactly the same message, which is nothing to report. He sends us like clockwork every day at exactly the same time, and every time he sends that message, there's a radio operator in England listening out for the message. They pick it up, they know the underlying plaintext, they program their bomb machines accordingly, and they break that particular cipher key every day on the basis of that one predictable message. And Gordon Welshman says, if only I could go out to North Africa and tell the Allied commanders not to bomb that radio station, or not to attack that unit. And eventually, of course, they do get attacked, and the messages stop. The situation on the ground changes, and they have to adapt. They have to find new ways into that cipher key. But there is always a German out there making a mistake that allows them into the cipher somewhere. A similar weakness is what we call re-encodements. So as I said, if you break a message on a simple cipher, you can use it to break into a more difficult one. And that's because sometimes the Germans will repeat a message in multiple cipher systems. And therefore, again, if you've broken a particular message, you see a message of the same length on a different cipher that you want to break, and you can guess that it might be the same message being sent on to a new recipient, you can program your bomb machines and break Enigma in that way. And the third human error is pure laziness. What the German Enigma operators have to do when they send a message is tell the man receiving that message how to set up his machine to decipher it. And so they use what's called an indicator, which refers to the positions of the free rotors in the machine. It's a bit like a password for that message. It just tells the recipient how to set his rotor so he can decipher it. And these indicators are meant to be completely random. And I don't need to tell you that people are very bad at being random. We have exactly the same problem with passwords now as the Germans had during the war in making their Enigma operators come up with random message indicators. This is the interactive part of the talk. Bletchley Park comes to know these as sillies because the Germans start to use predictable message indicators which you can guess just by looking at them. You have a first element which is unenciphered and the second element which is enciphered, and therefore you can use the unenciphered part to guess the enciphered part. And they're known as sillies because one of the first sillies which they discover is the name silly, which is they think a German operator's girlfriend's name. Have we got any guesses for the other solutions which you might be able to see? Hitler indeed. And the one at the bottom, Berlin. Very good. These are a little bit harder, but these are the cities which I find most interesting because they attest so much to the mindset of the operator sitting in his machine, having to come up with random characters. What do? You look at the keyboard. And you read along the top line and you get QWERTY, which is the German keyboard order. Or you draw vertical lines on the keyboard. So after QAY, you're likely to find WSX. And after EDC, you're likely to find RFB. So sometimes, a lot of the time, these methods don't work very well when the Germans are not doing very much, when they're not on active operations and the cyber clerks are being given the time to adhere to good cyber security. When operations are ongoing, everybody's very busy, very tired. They are changing, often having to send messages in the middle of the night. They're low, of course, low on sleep, and they start to make mistakes. And it's by you have to be mathematically skilled to do this work at Bletchley Park, but also you need to get inside the mind of the German who's sitting at his Enigma machine in the middle of the night somewhere out in occupied Europe and getting ready to type a message to anticipate the kind of mistakes he's going to make. I think that's something which probably applies to modern hackers as well. So in conclusion, of course the security systems used during World War II are no comparison to those used today. The way they work, obviously, is vastly different and vastly more complex. However, the weaknesses in many cases are very, very similar indeed, human factors, and we can learn a lot from the experience of Bletchley Park when we're trying to secure modern systems. So I will leave it there. I wanted to open the floor to any questions at this point.
Yes. Did we have our own cyber machines that we could use from the UK?
Yeah, Britain has a machine called TypeX, which is essentially a copy of Enigma. The British look at Enigma in the late 1920s and they say that's the simple version of the machine before the German military has changed it. And they decide that it's not very secure from a book of various forms of analysis, which were quite practical to do by hand. And therefore they decide not to use Enigma, but Britain doesn't actually have a cipher machine by the late 1930s. And it's the RAF actually who decide to take Enigma and make some improvements. I find TypeX very fascinating because it's built on exactly the same principle as Enigma, but it's made completely secure just by improving the complexity. And the thing about Enigma is you can always break it by attacking the different components of the machine separately. You don't have to treat it as one problem. And the most mathematically complex part of Enigma is that plug board, but often the plug board is the thing you break at the end. And often you can the way the machine is designed is you can leave that till later. What the British do with TypeX is they make one part of the machine really, really complex, which is the rotors. You have 5 rotors instead of 3 in Enigma. The British give their cipher operators 10 rotors to choose from, which gives you about 30,000 rotor orders just to begin with, which is far more than the 60 rotor orders on Enigma. And then the British do something very clever, which is they make the rotors go in either way up. You can flip them. And this increases the number of rotor orders which you can achieve from 30,000 to 970,000. So even if the Germans did have a bomb machine, you would need 970,000 of them if you wanted to test all those rotor orders in a timely manner, or you would need one machine running for a very, very long time. There are ways the Germans could have improved Enigma to just make it theoretically possible, but practically impossible to break. They don't do that. They leave the British a simple enough problem that they can just about stay on top of it throughout the war. But the Germans never make any progress with Type-X. Sorry, that's a very long answer to quite a short question.
Sorry. I was just going to ask that the Polish were involved very early on, weren't they? Were they involved mathematically? Did they play quite a big part, I think?
Yeah, it's a really big part because the methods the British are using at the beginning are gifted to the Polish. They are the Polish methods. And that's the amazing thing is the Polish do it with mathematics. One of the most impressive things is a Polish mathematician called Marian Rejewski. He's given a certain amount of information about Enigma. He's given some key sheets and he's given example messages, but he doesn't have any knowledge about how the machine is wired up. And you can wire the machine in a million different ways, or more than a million different ways. So it looks like an insurmountable problem, and the British at that point have similar access to similar information to decide Enigma is probably not breakable, and the French do as well. And Rejewski manages to come up with a way to reconstruct the wiring of the machine using maps, which none of his contemporaries managed to do with access to the same information. So it really is a case on occasion of one man having a flash of inspiration that nobody else does. But again, there's a component of human weakness and imagination in this as well. If you think about how the machine is wired up, when you're wiring together the connections from the plug board to the rotors, you can wire that part of the machine up in any order you like. You can feed any letter coming out of the plug board into any letter in the rotors. It doesn't make the machine any more complex to manufacture. It doesn't reduce the complexity of the encipherment. What it does is just it produces a component which the enemy have to either guess or capture a machine before they can break it. And so what do the Germans do? Well, they're very orderly. They wire it all up in alphabetical order. You've got 26 factorial possibilities in how you could do that wiring, and they do it in the most predictable possible way. But it's something that the British never managed to guess because they think it's too obvious and they never test it. And Rejewski goes, well, why wouldn't the Germans do that? We're going to try it. And when he plugs this assumption into his calculations, all of a sudden his equations start working. And the rotor wiring is revealed to him, and he's able to reconstruct the machine and then come up with ways of breaking it. And he's in on the ground floor in a way because the procedures at that point, as I said, are much simpler. The Germans are not changing their ciphers nearly as regularly as they are later on. They're only changing certain elements of the machine about 4 times a year. But it's still an amazing achievement, and it's thanks to Rejewski making that breakthrough that the Polish were in a position before the war to hand all their work over to the British, and they were able to keep the ball rolling.
So in effect, it's also identifying that weakness of predictability.
Yeah, I mean, the Polish are doing exactly the same thing that the British are in Helsinki. Exploiting the operator errors when they're breaking the 1930s. Absolutely. Any more questions? Okay.
Did the Germans ever figure out that their code's been broken?
They had their suspicions, especially the German Navy had their suspicions. Because in that case, it's harder to use signals intelligence at sea in a secure way, because if you have a U-boat out in the North Atlantic and suddenly an Allied aircraft turns up and sinks it, it looks a bit suspicious. Yeah. It's quite hard to do otherwise. And quite often they are very careful about acting on this intelligence, and they will give the enemy a reason to think that ship has been spotted before it's attacked, that isn't code breaking. So they will send a reconnaissance aircraft over the area and let the Germans see that the reconnaissance aircraft has spotted them, so they have a good explanation as to why the ship's been sunk. But Admiral Dönitz, who's in charge of the U-boats, he does eventually, on a couple of occasions actually, get suspicious and say, this is just, they're being too lucky at this point. Something's up. And he goes to his cryptanalysts and or his code makers and asks them to look at the security of Enigma, and the answer always comes back, no, Enigma is unbreakable. It's just simply too complex, and there must be a spy in our ranks. So they always blame spies. The Germans, they're naturally very suspicious about spies. Or they put it down to dumb luck. And there is never really a willingness to accept that Enigma might be breakable. And the Germans always view it as a mathematical problem, and they never really look at ways of breaking it which aren't brute force. And even if they do, they say, well, you need thousands of people, you need to bring them all into one place. You need to give them all this really expensive cryptanalytic machinery. It would be so much effort, and it would require such a big operation. Who would bother doing that? So the Germans never make a virtual part, they never create. They have about 9 different code breaking agencies, but they're never very big and never enormously successful. They never have one place where all this work goes on, and they never really think as big as the British do, and that's why they lose.
It would have only taken a spy here, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Well, this is true. There's nothing to stop you standing outside the gate and all these mathematicians in and saying, well, that's such and such from Cambridge. And they could probably deduce what was going on, but the British have the advantage that they've managed to sweep up all the German spies within about 2 weeks of war breaking out. Because they're much better at spying than the Germans are as well, and espionage in general. There is one spy in Bletchley Park, but he's a Soviet spy, John Cairncross. And he manages to smuggle a certain amount. He actually works not in cryptanalysis, but in the intelligence side of things. And he manages to smuggle decrypts out in his trousers and gives them to Stalin. He does that for a few months before he decides work at Bletchley Park doesn't really suit him. He doesn't like working in a drafty hut and living in Buckinghamshire. He'd much rather be in London, where he can go to the club for lunch. And so he gets transferred back again. He's not that effective as a spy, but as far as we know, no German spies ever penetrate the organisation. There are lots of little security breaches. There are people who say things they shouldn't in a small way, just to family members or to friends in the pub. And it's interesting that the reaction to this is always, it's never to prosecute them, it's never to fire them. It's always to say, we'll let you off this time, but don't do it again. We've got our eye on you. If they try and scare people, but they also try and keep them close. That way you hang on to valuable staff who are still useful if they're working. And if they're not out in the wide world where they could be even more dangerous, they keep them within the organisation. And even though there are lots of little security breaches, there's never enough information out there in the wider world for anyone to piece together what's going on until in the early 1970s when it all comes out anyway. I'm being asked to finish at that point. So I will leave it to I hope you have a great day here and